Triad stage for the 2018-2019 season, and was also the dramaturg for White Lightning. And I'll sort of be moderating this Technically Talking. So for Technically Talking, I'll lob the designers and the director, Sarah Hankins, some questions about the show, and then we'll open the floor if for any questions that you all may have. So I want to start out, first of all, wonderful show tonight. One more round of applause for everyone. And I want to start by asking Sarah a little bit about, I know that you, from the beginning of the design process, had a personal connection to this story, and just want to hear a little bit about that, and why should we produce White Lightning here and now?
Great question. So, little known fact about me. It's funny, a friend of mine mentioned it recently that I was on a New England tour of a show, and somebody disparaged Dale Earnhardt. And when I was in my very early 20s, and I got irate and kind of like threw down in the car about the value of NASCAR as a sport and about the value of Southern sports and Southern culture. And I didn't remember that I kind of showed my hind end, but I did. And I was reminded of it on Facebook recently when people knew that I was doing this show. So shout out to Susanna Malone and Tom Wells. My dad loved NASCAR. And one of the things that is special about that for me is that my father was a Harvard-educated man who was the editor of a small-town newspaper and was commonly considered to be one of the upstanding members of our community who was respectable and always willing to engage in a fight about politics. He usually fell on the liberal side of things, and so his love for NASCAR motorsports and Dale Earnhardt was unusual to the community. And I always appreciated the fact that my father unabashedly accepted and rejoiced in his Southern upbringing, and that was something that was really hard for me as a young woman because I entered the theater where having a Southern accent is not necessarily something that will get you hired, especially as a young actress, and I was primarily a classical actress. And so this story is really important to me because it's going back to appreciating NASCAR and remembering going to the Coca-Cola 600 with my dad. He was a big Dale Sr. fan. I, of course, loved Little League. So, so for me it was really important to investigate the history, and then because I am from Appalachia and I recognize the poverty from which these folks came, the moonshine industry wasn't just out of a sheer desire to make money, but out of a sheer desire to survive. And a lot of these folks didn't have the opportunity to escape poverty with any other way. Raymond Parks, who's mentioned several times in the play, is one of the most famous NASCAR team owners, and he owned the team for Roy Hall, one of the Flock brothers, and Red Byron, all of whom are mentioned in this play. And he was only able to escape poverty and bring his many siblings and cousins out of poverty because of his experience in the moonshine industry, and that's true of many people. It wasn't just a lark, it wasn't just, everybody loves to break the law, but seriously, it was one of the few ways in the South pre-war that you could make money, and fast became a way to continue to make money after the war, World War II that is.
Thank you so much. I'm going to backtrack a little bit and have everyone introduce themselves. I got a little excited, should have used my cheat sheet. So if you will introduce yourself and just talk a little bit about your role really quickly, and then I will ask you questions.
I'm Deb Bell, and I did the costume design.
I'm Amanda Veldez, and I'm the lighting designer.
I'm Victoria Ross, and I'm the prop apprentice.
I'm Natalie Hart, and I'm the scenic designer.
I'm Tannis, Boyajian, and I'm the technical director.
I'm Wurttele, and I'm the sound designer.
And what you will notice about this entire creative team, something you may notice about this entire creative team is that it's comprised of all women, which was totally unintended and just sort of happened, and we realized, not even at the beginning of the process, as we were going, we were like, oh wait, cool. Which I think is great because it speaks to the fact that it should be more common and that we are just all professionals and doing our work. So really exciting. So I want to start by asking Deb, our costume designer, just about, I know that for many, the process of many designers, particularly being familiar with your teaching style, because Deb is a teacher at UCG, that research is so integral to your access into a play. And so I'd just love to hear a little bit about how in this period piece, 1947, just rife with research, great things to look at, and a nice array of class and gender, for this play, how that sort of played a role in any particularly influential pieces of research or things that you found in your process.
Well, I think that just looking at some of these pioneers of race car driving was probably a major inspiration. And of course, 1940s costumes, has certainly a distinct look to it. I was telling Virginia earlier, I really do see this play as as heightened realism. It's not. Yes, they are poor. They're struggling. They're just finding their way. They're not fashion plates. On the other hand, there's the heightened realism of the youth and beauty of the lovers, and the cynicism of Hank, and the countrified quality of Chip that he taught me to appreciate, and then the sheer simplicity, the beautiful simplicity of mud. And so, I sometimes think that it's a real balance to try to integrate, heightened realism with a sense of the period of the play in a case like this, because there is such a romantic dimension to it. I don't think that Erin Dixie has to have dirty fingernails in order to present her character authentically. There's more than that. And just as the car, and I'm sure Natalie's going to talk about this, I think just as the car can evoke a sense of heightened realism, it's not a real jalopy from the 1940s, well actually 10 years earlier, but it's, there's a heightened realism to it. And I think costumes, I think people don't as often expect that in costumes, but I think they'd actually just be happy with the 1940s pants and be done with it. But I think that you can also do the same thing with costumes if you're looking out for that kind of style. So.
Thank you. I'm gonna keep trekking on to Amanda, our lighting designer. I'd love to ask you about and it's great, Deb, that you mentioned that there is the style versus realistic parts of this play, and I'd love to hear from a lighting perspective the stark contrast between the scenes and the transitions, how you were able to collaborate with Sarah, and sort of how you guys together developed a vocabulary for very different lighting worlds. You have all sorts of different instruments and there's so many components to the color scheme and the subtleties of atmospherics, and I'm just curious, do you have any preferences in that aesthetically, and just how that came to be?
Thank you. I think Sarah and I hit it off really quickly the moment she was like, I don't really care about realism. And I was like, yeah, girl, yeah. So the process started really simply, which was I began looking into color and texture research, and my first route that I went to was music, and Maria actually made this great playlist on Spotify. So I was listening to her playlist and I was like, I think I'm gonna go a little more in depth with some abstract images through bluegrass. And so I started looking at old and new contemporary bluegrass posters and studying the color and the texture, and I started to see this repetition in which there was this strong juxtaposition of blues with sepia tones. And I started looking at moonshine typography labels, and they all have this thing in common where there was this kind of filigree texture to it. And I was like, that's really pretty, because usually in realism, as a lighting designer, we're so bent on, you know, appropriate shadows and you know, linear construction type shadows, and with the filigree texture that I saw on all these labels, and I just thought it was so different, and it could be so pretty and otherworldly. And so I showed some images to Sarah, and she was like, that's really cool. You know, I was thinking, you know, the prologue scenes and the announcers could be just moody and have this crazy, you know, bluegrassy floor paint to them. And a lot of my realism research stemmed from a project called the Appalachian Project, which is a blog post, actually a website of photographers that take a lot of sort of photojournalistic realism moments of just living the life in, you know, Appalachian areas, and those images, you know, drenched in realism, also had such texture to them, like a ton of foliage, tree texture. It's so luscious and filled with greenery. So while we have this like floor painting filigree that I've done, I also wanted to do some floor painting with some trees. If I had to choose, I mean, the surrealistic stuff is always way more fun, but I think that it takes a skill and a knack to be able to really study daylight and sunsets and making sure that the shadows are low versus high. I think personally, I find it fun to just do the fun, like the more abstract stuff. But a lot of the realistic scenes challenged me as a lighting designer to try and get it right. And I made sure that, you know, some of the like, for example, the tree texture is a little heightened, you know, a little, it's realistic, but it's alluding to realism. It's not really the real thing. So trying to find that balance is fun, I guess. Did I answer your question?
Yes. And I also love that. I think with costumes or with scenic design, there's a little more access to research of, you know, architecture of a certain period or clothing, you know, daily life. But for lighting design, that, you know, you can't search the sky in 1947, and so I think it's even the way that you conduct research and where you find inspiration is so different than, you know, pulling images and designing from there. So yeah, that's fascinating. So I want to move on to Victoria Ross, our props apprentice and props artisan on the show. The car! Oh my gosh! Yes. Can you take us through the process? I'm really interested in obviously the construction and, you know, how it came from Natalie's page to, you know, the enacting it, and curious, did you have to experiment with different materials, and so what is it made of? Just take us through her whole journey.
It all started 2 months ago. So what initially happened was Natalie purchased a scale-sized model of the car, and her boys loved it, but we took it for work, and we made a foam cast out of it and truncated it so that it would fit proportions on the stage. And then we used that scale size with little, almost like floral wire, to bend shapes around the fenders. And then we projected that to scale on a wall and bent what's called pencil rod, thin pencil-sized metal, to that same shape to basically blow up the car. So I made individual segments, which then I welded together in portions, and then found places to tab it together, because if you haven't noticed, there's no way to get big things in this theater. Everything has to fit through a normal size door. So we had to tab it into different sections. So the sides are actually their own pieces, the front is its own piece, the grill and the trunk all separate. And then we covered it with its polystyrene strips, which is actually what styrofoam is made of, but it's compressed. So this beautiful spray paint makes it look like metal, but it actually is plastic with double layers. And there's a lot of glue and tape and welds in this. Blood, sweat, tears, and hair. It's been a really long process, but it was cool to kind of see it go from a skeleton kind of cage, and then we skinned it, which is kind of not the appropriate word because skinning means to actually take it off. But we put skin onto it and then started cutting away for lights and for acting and sightline purposes. And really at the end it was a full push. We had about 10 people working on the car to make sure it was going to be done. There's still plenty to do, plenty of notes left on it, but her name is Lady Carmichael. She is a needy car, but we do love her so.
So are all the materials that you used on the pencil, steel and things, were those the first things that you would use? Did you have to do any experimentation early on?
So I am very fortunate that the prop master, Hart, is very familiar with many types of mediums. So I did not have to stress about any of the materials. We ordered pencil rod and that worked the way we needed. We ordered polystyrene, it worked the way we needed. I think the one part that was hard was how are we going to attach the strips to the metal? And at first we thought wiring, we could just wire it around, but that was going to take forever. So we ended up, Eric again found some silicone self-adhesive tape, because silicone likes to stick to itself. And that we ended up using some glue adhesive, which we intended to use in the first place, and instead of wire went to tape. But I think, and then there was a few different spray paint samples that he had shown that were experiments, but everything kind of really came out nicely. There was no half skinning, or we're like, this looks awful, we have to start all over. So that was pretty fortunate.
Yeah, terrific. Great. And connected to that, Natalie, our scenic designer, I would love to just kind of a compound question. First of all, I know you and Sarah early on took a field trip, and I would love to hear a little bit about that and how that inspired your design. And then also just, there's so much, I think at first glance it looks sparse, but there's so much meaning packed in every element on stage. And so again, I know this sounds broad, but just a general walkthrough of how you collaborated to arrive at this set. A big question.
I think when Sarah and I started our first meeting, I said something along the lines of, I don't know if you know this or not, but there's a car in this play. So we had to deal with that and what that would mean, and what that would mean in terms of space, and especially in a thrust space where there's an audience on three sides that you need to see through. So our second meeting, I think, we met and went to the NASCAR Hall of Fame in Charlotte, which was awesome. And at that point, we weren't even talking about, like, let's put this here and that there and whatever. We were just talking about what the world was. And we sort of started out talking about wanting to stay away from nostalgia. We wanted to not paint it with a rosy lens. We wanted to capture the danger. You know, we think that Hank did have that barn burned down with those people in it, and that the decisions that the people were making were truly about survival and about life and death. So that trip was really instrumental to kind of like immersing ourselves in the textures and colors and shapes and you know, items that were in the world and that would be common. So that kind of started the vocabulary that we were gonna talk about. And then I put it all together, and I like to design not what things look like, but how they feel. And so this is sort of like a broad brush of that. So I have, most of the set is the red clay road, and then the racing stuff. I don't know if you noticed above our heads, there's the little bit of racing stripes inside the header, and then the asphalt deck that this sits on top of. And then the bottom, for me, where your feet are the cabin floor, and I took that from some research from Tennessee. And then it all sits on top of the mason jars, and they're filled with money, so it's about money. And then the mason jars up above too. That was one of the early things too, was like, okay, for the races, let's do chase lights, but they're in mason jars. Is that too silly? Nah, that's not too silly. Yeah, did I?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the ability to create that sense that you're at a race without having a real car or being at a race. You know, the original production, this is only the second production ever of this show, and the original, they actually had the car. They had a Ford V8, and so we were it's not like we could look at other productions and glean inspiration. It was, you know, totally, how do we find an abstraction that works, you know, for this show, and I think.
Yeah, well, and that's part of the trick of the play too. The first production was in a proscenium space with audience on one side, so we had to make choices that would work for us. You know, seeing through the car is really helpful so that the audience on either side still feels connected to the characters on the other side. And then in the script, you know, they talk about there's a sign on the car, and then there's another sign on the car, and now it's muddy, and now it's broken, and, you know, now it's fixed and everything. And I said, you know, in this phase where we can't close a curtain and change things, I don't want to spend time and energy putting all of those real things on. I'd like to make something that's like the ghost of a car, that's just a shape that we project our ideas on. So when the actor says, look, it's muddy, we're all imagining that it's muddy, and that's enough, and we're putting our own ideas onto this shape instead of putting the reality of a car in the space.
Absolutely. And I think that vocabulary that's created of having, you know, the fewer actual real pieces helps keep the play moving and helps make it feel like a race, and something that Sarah talked about a lot that incorporated into the entire play, to talk about it for you, was the transitions as pit crew coming out, and seeing the crew members in those costumes, and, you know, getting to see those quick changes. I think it all just coalesced so beautifully. It made so much sense, and just kept the play, you know, moving forward. Awesome, thank you.
Tannis, our technical director, first of all, will you tell us what is a technical director? You know, what exactly do you do? It was nice to get the three of you in a row and see how, from design to construction, how this whole process works. And I'd love if you talk a little bit about this gigantic upper piece, and how does that happen? How did you get it up there? You know, already, Victoria, you mentioned the construction. You have to keep in mind how things are reassembled in this space. So I just love to hear how you made that come to life.
You'll forgive me, I don't get put on this side of the stage very often, so I'm not super comfortable, but I'm thrilled to be here and talk with all of you. So as a technical director, my job is to work very closely with Natalie as the set designer, and she brings all of these really wonderful ideas to the table, and then it's my job to figure out how to make them work and how to get them into this space and how to create them in reality. And it's very exciting, and to see it all come together in the space is always wonderful. So I'm kind of like the engineer. I take her ideas and her designs, and then I draft them like the blueprints for a house, and I send those to the shop floor and work with our carpenters as far as creating it and building it, and then helping to load it into the space and maintain it throughout the run. And as they mentioned before, this gorgeous overhead unit with all of the mason jars was a really fun project because it involved so many different departments. Between paints and props and lighting and scenery, everybody played a little part of it, and then even bringing it into the building. Because it is so big, we had to break it into multiple pieces, but since it's wired to do the chase, it had to be fully assembled and wired on the deck and then lifted into the air as one solid unit. So we ended up adding about 8 ropes to it. We don't have a fly system in this space, so everything that we put in the air is fully man-powered. So we added 8 rope drop lines, and we brought the whole production team in and all of our artistic staff, And everybody got on a rope and we hoisted this into the air and tied it off, and then we added our real pick points once it was up there. So it was a really great kind of coming together, not only of the production department, but also of our whole artistic staff and company. So it was really, really exciting and really great to see it finally rise up into the air.
Can you see it on Instagram?
Yeah. The whole process of more people
That's right.
coming in.
Rich help.
Yes, everyone played their part. Perfect. Thank you so much, Tannis. And last but certainly not least, Maria, our sound designer. I cannot stress enough how much Maria had to do on this show. It is a show, again, because of the sense of sparseness, that so much of where and when we are is told to us through sound, whether or not we're aware of it. You know, there's atmospheric sound, you know, with music and underscoring. There were live microphones and singing. There were also a lot of sound effects. I mean, the whole gamut for you, and I just, that entire process. And I was curious how, you know, how you and Sarah were able to talk about all of those things. Did you sort of approach all of that holistically and then sort of problem solve as you go? Did you talk about them separately? What were your favorite parts? There's so much to ask about, and I don't want to pick any one thing, so I'm just curious as to how you guys even began to approach the many demands of this show.
It's so funny when you say it like that. I'm like, whoa, it's been a blur, but it was all of those things. I think one of the first times that Sarah and I talked, one of my first questions was, so what is the set? What are the lights? Like, there's a car and there's a race, and we're in so many different settings. And she immediately was like, well, it's not really going to be a real car. It's going to be like this cool abstraction of a car. And so then my next approach was, well, if we're going really abstract with so many elements, does sound design live in the abstract world, or do I fill in that void of the realism part? And that's definitely been a challenge because we have these hyper-realistic moments with the announcers, and then we snap into a scene. And so I think the way I went about it was to sort of set up and almost highlight, instead of doing the sound design, do the talking of like where we're at, just highlight almost, because the characters are telling us where we're at, really. And so I kind of set up the scene in like, oh, we're in traffic now, and now you all know that, and it can go away now. And then in terms of the announcer moments, those were really exciting, but also a huge challenge because we had lines that needed to be heard. We had music that kind of amped up the scene, and we needed to create the atmosphere of a really exciting race. And all those elements are competing to be heard. And of course, the most important part is to understand what the actors are saying. So my first thought was, okay, well, mics are going to be really useful to just amplify their voice, but also kind of fits in with the grandstand, and those announcers would be mic'd anyway. But on a separate level, it's a really clear cue to give you guys that we are snapping into a surrealistic moment because it's so different from the rest of the scenes where they're not mic'd at all. So that's kind of how we give those clear audience cues. And yeah, I used music to inspire me a lot. I mean, it starts with a song, with a very famous folk song, The Moonshiner. And I kind of went from there and did a lot of research into period music, and then kind of took some creative license and found more contemporary stuff that sort of still fit in with that. But yeah, we got to work with some really talented musicians, which was really cool, and I don't know, it was so collaborative every step of the way. Even in those scenes, I still wanted to sort of highlight some of the heightened realism by adding some sound to like the vocabulary of the moonshine, and when they're drinking it, and when it's out, and when it's tense, and when it's not. And that has evolved every single day. It's been different almost, because, you know, I react to what the actors are giving me, and if in my head it's one way and I think this is going to sound really great, but then an actor says something in a certain tone or does a certain action, or even just does something that I'm not expecting, I have to react to that to make it all kind of work together. So that's sort of what tech is for me. You kind of just discover stuff as we go along, and then you watch it with an audience and you get, oh, okay, wait, that's a different thing that I need to change and stuff like that. So I've kind of loved every step of the way, but definitely tech is always my favorite part because it just evolves every day, and that's really cool to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think every,